Here is a simple, short remedies problem that you can learn a great deal from. This is a question that raises some of the more difficult issues from torts and contracts, and it does so in a straightforward yet subtle way. Take a look at the call of the question. It reads, on what theory or theories, if any, may Fidelity sue Buildco and Mason, and what damages should it recover from each? Discuss. Well, we can organize at least a vaguely thoughtful answer to this fact pattern before we even read it. We can just look at the call of the question and realize we've got two lawsuits. Fidelity versus Buildco and Fidelity versus Mason. For each one of those two defendants, the plaintiff is going to have one or more theories of liability, and we are told to think about damages. But let's pause for a moment. What do you think the examiners mean when they say theory or theories? Now, we can well interpret this as calling for a couple of different tort theories, like, for example, negligence and strict liability. But another way to look at this language, when the examiners are asking about theories, it's wise to consider that perhaps questions are going to arise from more than one subject on the exam, rather than multiple theories within one subject. Take a look at the facts. This is a subtle, interesting question. In paragraph 1, we find out about Fidelity. That's our plaintiff, and they have just opened a big office building. And the problem with the office building is with regard to the brick masonry. Cracks have developed, and some bricks have fallen to the sidewalk below. The masonry is dangerous for pedestrians, and the cause of the cracks is negligence by brick masons in preparing the mortar. So it looks as if they are spoon-feeding us the theory of liability, that it will be negligence. And in fact, that is one of the theories that will be litigated between these parties. The rest of the building is structurally sound, although it is unsightly. All right, so Fidelity intended to get a nice new office building, and instead they've got an office building that has cosmetic problems. In other words, it's ugly, and it's also dangerous. But the problems with the building appear to be superficial. There's nothing fundamentally wrong with the building, but we've got problems with negligently created masonry, and it's ugly and dangerous. So far, so good. Now, look at paragraph 2. This is where all of the most complicated issues are raised. But look at the very first few words. We read, Fidelity had contracted. All right, that's as clear as they need to make it. We've got two theories of liability here, one arising out of tort and one arising out of contracts. Now read carefully, because what this paragraph is going to raise ultimately are issues related to intended third-party beneficiaries. And that's part of the contracts outline that many of us hate and fear the most. Well, it's a lot easier to learn this law by studying and working through hypotheticals than it is just reading the law and trying to memorize it. As we look at the way that the relationships between these parties play out, the third-party beneficiary theory really is right at the surface, and it isn't hidden at all. You've just got to be alert enough to go look for it. So take a look at paragraph 2. We learned that Fidelity had contracted with Buildco to build this multi-million-dollar building. Buildco is the general contractor, and they used reasonable care to select Mason, an independent entity, to do the brickwork. The preparation was all done by Mason's employees using Mason's equipment. But read further. Buildco's supervisor was on the scene at the time and made many suggestions, and they were routinely followed. So although we do have an independent contractor working on this project, that independent contractor really isn't independent. The independent contractor of Mason is working directly under Buildco. So Buildco and Mason likely are going to be jointly liable in torts, and the contract issues become a little bit more interesting. In the last very short paragraph, we find out about the damages. $300,000 to repair the masonry so that it'll be safe, and another $200,000 to make the masonry more attractive. This is an interesting question, and it's a very complicated one. My view is that the shorter the fact pattern, the more difficult it's likely to be. But here, the examiners give us pretty express hints about what the issues are. They use the word negligence and they use the word contracted. And those are two key words. So turn the page and take a look at how I have chosen to outline an answer to this question. This is one of the many essay questions that you will likely pass or fail before you even write your first word. This is a fact pattern that requires careful organization, and without that, it's difficult to do really good analysis. So look at how I have broken it down. As I anticipated just by looking at the call of the question, I realized that there are two lawsuits, Fidelity versus Buildco and Fidelity versus Mason. The first lawsuit between Fidelity and Buildco is the more complicated one, and it's the one that has a lot more pieces to it. You'll notice that the way I've organized it allows me to ultimately write an answer where I can focus very narrowly and specifically on the facts of the pattern, connecting them up with elements of the legal analysis. So let's go through and have a look at the contracts analysis between Fidelity and Buildco. There's no formation problems here because this is all about performance, breach, and damages. There isn't a single fact in the pattern that makes us think there's anything wrong with formation or any of the other preliminary issues related to contracts. Clearly, Buildco has breached this agreement because the contract between Fidelity and Buildco was for the erection of a safe, new, attractive building. And in those respects, the contract has been breached. We look at the damages that have been suffered. They both would be compensable based on the breach of contract theory. So Fidelity can obtain full relief from Buildco just based on its first theory. But on the bar exam, as in court, our job is to raise all of the potentially valid theories of liability and then analyze them in turn. So we've already established Buildco's liability for all of the damages caused in contracts. But next we consider the negligence theory of liability, and here we consider the basic elements of negligence: duty, breach, causation, damages, and defenses before we reach a conclusion. And here again, the plaintiff is going to be successful. The only issue where the defense really can raise some issues is with regard to duty, alleging that Mason was an independent contractor, and the facts do state that as being the case. However, a more careful analysis reveals that Mason was basically functioning under the supervision of Buildco. So although technically Mason was an independent contractor, in fact, all of their work was being directly supervised by Buildco, so Buildco really can't hide behind Mason and avoid liability. So clearly, the breach is more or less stipulated by the facts. There was negligence, and that negligence, both actually and proximately, caused the damages that have been suffered by Buildco. And here again, all of the various damages suffered would be compensable here in negligence. And ultimately we reach the conclusion that Buildco is on the hook. Buildco is going to be liable for all of the damages either under the torts or under the contracts theory. Very straightforward, comparatively simple. But we've got to organize carefully, and the fatal mistake was to not spot that there were both torts and contract theories of liability. Now let's turn to Fidelity versus Mason. Again, there are two different theories of liability. The first one is negligence. We don't really have anything new to say here other than perhaps Mason would try to hide behind Buildco's supervisor, alleging that really the problem is Buildco's fault. And I suppose, depending on how the testimony played out in court, it's possible that that would be a successful defense in negligence. But I think the more likely result is that Mason and Buildco will be jointly and severally liable in negligence. Now we turn to the most interesting and the most difficult theory presented by these facts, and that's the contracts theory between Fidelity and Mason. And here it is a third-party beneficiary contract. Let's examine the facts carefully. Buildco and Mason contracted for the subcontracting work on the masonry. So we see that Fidelity is not a party to that agreement. However, Fidelity is the intended third-party beneficiary of the contract between Buildco and Mason. And as a result, this intended third-party beneficiary can assert rights under the contract directly. And that's the case here. So the theory of liability between Fidelity and Mason here is breach of contract based on the intended third-party beneficiary status of the plaintiff. This is yet another winning theory of liability. So here I am, the defense lawyer, basically saying this is a case the defense needs to settle quickly because the plaintiff has got two successful theories of liability against both defendants. So another little detail that's sort of interesting about this fact pattern is typically there are ways to distinguish the liability between the parties. Often one party will face liability differently than the other. And although I think that some arguments along those lines can be crafted, I've suggested one or two of them, in the end, I think that these defendants are both liable under both theories of liability for all of the damages that were suffered by the plaintiff. And that concludes a discussion of a short fact pattern that gives rise to complicated issues and that presents important issues about organization, as well as the black letter law issues arising between these parties.